The question I want to ask this morning is, where are the godly men? Where are the godly men? And in saying that, I certainly am not saying that I have arrived. But I think it's a fair question. Where are the godly men in Canada? Where are the godly men in Alberta? Where are the godly men in Calgary? I believe the greatest weakness in our Bible preaching churches is the lack of godly men. I see it in missionary reports where missionary pastors are constantly asking supporters to pray that God would raise up godly men to be leaders in their churches, to be deacons, so that they can then train pastors to turn it over to a national pastor. You constantly see that in missionary prayer updates. The greatest weakness in our Bible-believing churches is the lack of godly men, the lack of godly husbands, the lack of godly fathers, and the lack of godly friends, so the lack of godly singles. We in our Bible-preaching churches have an abundance of nice men, but not enough spiritually mature men. Men who know more than simply Bible verses. They're living out the Bible verses. And maybe you're thinking here, that's right, Pastor Michael, preach it. The men in other churches need to shape up. Well, let me bring it a little closer to home then. The greatest weakness at Foundation Baptist Church is the lack of godly men. And you may protest, oh, Pastor Michael, we have several godly men. And that's right, several. And of those, a few of those are senior citizens and won't be with us in 10 or 15 years. The greatest weakness at Foundation Baptist Church is the lack of godly husbands, fathers, and friends. You see, at Foundation, we have a lot of nice men, but we don't have enough godly men. We have quite a few pleasant men that are enjoyable to be around, but we don't have enough spiritually mature men. And maybe you say, Pastor Michael, I've only been saved for a few years. Do you expect me to be spiritually mature? No, I don't. And neither does God. And that's why this morning I'm going to teach you on how to become a godly man. We won't get all the way through it this week. As I was preparing this week, I realized that this is way longer than one message. So rather than keep you here for an hour and 15 minutes, I'm going to split it up this week and next Sunday morning. I believe the greatest need in our day, not just in Canada, but all around the world, is for men to grow to godly manhood and then disciple those within their sphere of influence. Each one of you has influence. Are you discipling those within your influence? For instance, you may have a wife and a daughter or several daughters. I have one. Some of you have more than one. And those daughters need to learn how to dress modestly. Your wife needs to learn how to dress modestly. But they don't understand how guys think. They don't understand modesty usually in the way that a man does, because they don't know how a man thinks. You need to teach them how to apply the biblical principles about modesty so that they do not put stumbling blocks in front of their Christian brothers. That's your responsibility as a husband. That's your responsibility as a dad. You see, so many people want the pastor to do what they should be doing for themselves. I'm here to reinforce and equip, but the primary responsibility is on you as husbands and fathers to teach your wife and your daughters what it means to dress modestly, to love your fellow man by dressing modestly. We have boys who sit in front of video game screens for hours and hours and hours, day after day after day, because their dad has not modeled for them how to discipline themselves. We have young men who don't have godly dads, and it's not the young men's fault. Maybe they don't even have a dad in their life, but they need mentoring. Maybe their dad's not saved, and so they need another man in the church to come alongside of them and care enough about them to show them what godly manhood is, to spend time with them and to teach them and to mentor them. We have Sunday school classes that need teachers. We need godly men to fill these classes, and we need men of character to teach. Again, I'm not saying there aren't godly men at Foundation. I'm thankful for the godly men that the Lord has raised up at Foundation. Pastor Greg and I can't take credit for that. The Lord gets all the credit for that. But what I'm saying is we need more. Godly men are the greatest need of the day. That's our lesson for today. I'm going to state it at the beginning. I'll probably state it in the middle, and I'll probably state it at the end again. Here's the point of the message today, is that godly men are the greatest need of our day. And you may protest and say, well, Pastor Michael, I understand what you're saying, but seeing God work is the greatest need of the day. And I understand what you're saying there, but how does God usually work? He usually works through the men of a nation. And that's not chauvinistic. I will try and demonstrate that statistically. But God usually works through pretty ordinary means. And the ordinary means, which is actually extraordinary, are usually godly husbands, fathers, and friends. Bible-preaching churches, not just in North America, but all across the world, have children and teenagers that are being attracted to alcohol and drugs because their dads drink. And they think, well, dad drank, so why can't I? We have families floundering in churches that are weak. Churches that don't understand worldliness, don't understand practical holiness at all, because their dad has led them to that church and he doesn't have the spiritual sense to get them into a church that will teach them how to apply biblical principles. We have pastors who once took holiness very seriously, now leading their churches into unbiblical ministry associations. And in 10 to 20 years, these churches will look pretty much like every other church around. If ever the church needed godly men, the time is now. So that's the answer to the first question. Where are the godly men? And the answer is there isn't a lot of them. There aren't a lot of them. Second question. What is godly manhood? What is godly manhood? Have you thought about it? If your dad asks you, what does it mean to be a godly man, Dad? What would you say? If your grandson asked you, what would you say? And I know some of you may have dropped the ball with your kids, but now you have an opportunity to influence your grandkids. I want to start by saying what godly manhood is not. Godly manhood is not a personality type. Why do I say this? Well, dads sometimes make excuses for why they're not leading their families because they say, I don't have the personality of a leader. You know, I'm not a type A personality. I'm not an extrovert. I'm laid back. I just prefer working with my hands, whatever. Godly manhood is not a personality. Let me see if I can illustrate this from my life. Lisa's dad and my dad, Carl Monroe and Tony Miller, are about as different in personality as any men could be. Lisa's dad was a chemist. He was very reserved. He was quiet. He was not outgoing at all. My dad is an extrovert. He is outgoing. He's in full-time vocational ministry. As far as men go, they are very different in their personalities, and yet I admire them both because both modeled godly manhood. My dad cares about souls, he cares about the word, and he cares about making disciples. Lisa's dad cared about souls, he cared about the word, and he cared about making disciples. I have so much respect for both these men. Two totally different personalities. My father-in-law, he was quiet, but yet he was courageous. He was a soul winner. My dad is not quiet. He's an extrovert, and yet he is courageous. He is a soul winner. We need to stop using our personality men as an excuse for a failure to be godly men. It's not a personality. Godly manhood are not activities. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, we've got this notion, some men have this notion in North America that being a man is all about doing certain activities, whether it be sports, having big muscles, hunting and fishing, or cars or motorcycles. And I'm not against any of those things, and I enjoy some of those things very much. But the fact that you can teach your boy how to hunt and fish doesn't mean you're teaching him how to be a man. There are a lot of godly men who could care less about hunting and fishing, and I happen to like fishing a little bit more than hunting, but I hunted with my dad growing up, and I'll hunt with my boys. Godly manhood is not certain activities. We need to leave that notion behind. Well, if I teach them how to use a knife, if I teach them how to work out, if I teach them how to play soccer, if I teach them how to catch a fish, then I'm teaching them the important issues of manhood. It doesn't cut it, man. Godly manhood is also not the ability to father children. Some people think when they reach sexual maturity that they're a man. They may be a man, but they're not necessarily a godly man. It's not just the ability to father children. Why? What is the point of bringing a child into the world if we do not intend to disciple them? What is the point of bringing a child into the world if we're going to work all the time and we don't have any time for them? What is the point of bringing a child into the world if we're going to play golf all the time or watch TV all the time and not disciple them? Next week, when I give you the notes for this handout, and I will give you an extensive handout next week when we finish up part 2, so you don't have to worry to frantically write everything down today. But I will give you a couple articles that discuss the importance of fathers, both to their sons and to their daughters. Do you realize that the United States of America has the largest percentage of single-parent homes of any country in the world? Can you believe that? And people at other parts of the world think America is a Christian nation. I remember in India telling some of my Indian friends over there that the percentage of Christians in Canada is maybe 5 or 10%, and it just blew their minds. There is very little Christian about America anymore. We're blessed in still some remarkable ways, but we're even seeing some of those blessings taken away. And one of the reasons is America has the largest percentage of single-parent homes, 23%. The number might even be higher than that now, of any country in the world. And Canada is not far behind, probably about 17 or 18%. We're talking about kids that are not growing up in homes with two parents. Fatherless homes are perhaps the leading cause of spiritual decline in any nation. And we're seeing that in Canada and the United States. Pastor James Merritt, in his book Friends, Foes, and Fools, cites some staggering statistics about fatherless homes. He says fatherless children are anywhere from 100 to 200% more likely to have emotional and behavioral problems. Most of the reason that the kids at schools are acting up and the teachers can't teach them anything is because dad is not there. A child who comes from a fatherless home is twice as likely to use drugs or alcohol, far more likely to become sexually active at an early age, and 3 times more likely to commit a violent crime. Over 50%, so one half, over 50% of teenagers who attempt suicide come from single-parent homes. 80% of teenagers who are admitted to psychiatric hospitals come from homes without a father present. And children from fatherless homes are 50% more likely to have learning disabilities and 20 to 40% more likely, or 200 to 400%, 200 to 400% more likely to have health problems. So we understand, friends, do we not, that the dad is really the key figure in the boys' lives besides God himself. And if dad is absent or he's present but not fulfilling his responsibilities, then it's no wonder when the boys don't turn out. But here's something interesting. dads are not only the key influence in the life of his sons, dads are also the key influence in the life of his daughters. We usually think of the mother as the key influence, and I'm not minimizing that. I'm so thankful for the job that Lisa does with our kids. But studies are showing that dads are also the key to the daughter's spiritual well-being. Merritt cites a couple statistics about this. He says fatherless daughters are 53% more likely to marry as teenagers, 111% more likely to have children as teenagers, and 100% more likely to have a child out of wedlock. And then when the daughters do get married, fatherless daughters, so daughters who grew up in a home where the father was largely absent, when they get married, they have a 92% higher divorce rate than a girl who has a father in the home. So fathers, it's not just your boys that need you. You are the critical influence in your daughters' lives. Not their mothers. I'm not diminishing the importance of the mom, but I'm just saying statistics are showing that the father is the critical influence in both sons and daughters' lives. Merritt says, according to a study published in the Journal of Research and Crime and Delinquency, the best indicator of violent crime in a community is not race, income, or employment, but the proportion of fatherless families. What am I saying, dads? Basically, I'm saying that as you go, your family will probably go as well. As you go, your kids and grandkids will probably go. And we see this all throughout the Old Testament, particularly in Kings and Chronicles. Jehoshaphat loved God, but made some terrible compromises with worldliness, and what happened to his kids and grandkids? It was spiritual disaster. So what is godly manhood? That's what it's not. It's not a personality. It's not activities. It's not the ability to father children. So you say, what is godly manhood? Godly manhood is influence for God. A godly man is someone who influences others for God. In other words, a godly man is a disciple maker. Whether he's a father, whether he's a husband, he's a single, whether he's a teenage man, godly men are disciple makers, period. If you're not a disciple maker, you're not a godly man. What is our primary way as a new covenant believer to show our love for God in this time? Well, he left us on earth to worship and love him, but we could do that in heaven, right? So why did he leave us on earth? He left us on earth to evangelize and make disciples, to share the gospel, and then when people are born again, to train them. Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20 makes this unmistakably clear. Your primary responsibility is to show love for God as a Christian man by making disciples. And so if you're a godly man, you are a disciple maker. If you're married, then you'll disciple your wife and you'll disciple your kids. If you're single, then you'll disciple your friends from church. Godly manhood is not about whether you are married or not. Let me repeat that. Godly manhood is not about whether you are married or not, but whether you make disciples. And so single men, don't set your highest goal in life for getting married. That's not your highest goal. Your highest goal is to love God by being a disciple maker. What does this require? Well, it basically requires three things. And this is where I'll have you turn to Daniel chapter 11. That was an extensive introduction. But I wanted to share the need with you for godly men before we get to how to be a godly man. We'll expand this next week. But what is godly manhood? Daniel chapter 11. You say, that's an interesting passage. Daniel is primarily prophecy. That's true. And this prophecy here in Daniel chapter 11 about Antiochus Epiphanes, a prefiguring of the Antichrist, this historical figure before Jesus' time who came in and did great damage to the Jewish people. But he was resisted by some Jews, Who were these Jews who stood against the evil of Antiochus Epiphanes? Daniel chapter 11, verse 32, a very important verse about what it means to be a godly leader. Leaders are influencers, whether for good or for bad. Right now in Canada, we have a bad leader, and he's a terrible influence. Leaders are influencers, whether for good or bad. But these leaders in Israel, in the days before Jesus, notice verse 32. It says, he, Antiochus Epiphanes, by smooth words, he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly towards the covenant. So he's going to he led some Jews away from the Mosaic covenant, away from God. But not everybody followed along. And who were these people? He says, the people who know their God will be strong and take action. And those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Now, unfortunately, some of them will meet a disastrous end for their righteousness. Look at what he says. He says, yeah, they will fall by sword and flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now, when they fall, they will be granted a little help. So, these people that stand for righteousness aren't totally excluded from the fate of other Israelites who lived wickedly who will fall, but they will be granted a little help, verse 34 tells us. So what is it about these people? Here's what I call the Daniel 11:32 Triad of Leadership. Triad, of course, means three. The Daniel 11:32 Triad of Leadership. What does it involve? Number one, it involves knowing. Knowing. What do they know? Verse 32 tells us they know their God. They walk with God. They have a personal relationship with God. They've been born again, and then they pursue God. They pursue that friendship with God. They know him. They are experiencing his working in their life, and they grow to spiritual maturity because they are pursuing knowing God. Their greatest pleasure is giving God pleasure. It's worshiping and knowing God. That's what we were created for. Colossians 1:16 says we were created by Christ for Christ. We were created to know God. And the people who know God experience this personal relationship, this close friendship. Then what happens is they're getting to know God. Something develops in their life. It's called character. Notice what he says there in verse 32. The people who know their God will be strong, will display strength. Literally, will be strong. That's character. They have the character to do something. Their character develops. In the New Testament, in Galatians 5, Paul describes it as the fruit the Holy Spirit produces in our lives. He produces this character, this love and joy and peace. They're godly men. They get to spiritual maturity because they're pursuing God. So they know, they have character, and then what happens? Here's the third part of the triad. Our translation translates it take action, and that's a good translation. The basic Hebrew word means to do. To do what? To do courageous and valiant acts for God here. Here in context, to stand against the evil. Verse 33, to give understanding to many. These are people that have spiritual insight, and so they pass that spiritual insight unto their wives, their kids, their grandkids, if they're single, to their friends. They're leaders, they're influencers, they do something. They're not sitting at home watching TV all night. They're doing something worthwhile. They're not abandoning their family just to provide nice things for them, and so they work all the time. They are doing things that are spiritually significant. They're making a difference. Why? Because they understand this Daniel 11:32 triad. I've summarized it in this way. This is what godly manhood is all about, and godly womanhood for that matter. But it starts with knowing. The people that know their God, that is their competency. Then they become something. Second part of the triad. That's their character, their competency, their character, and then they do something, their courage. So where does it start? It starts with knowing, and then it leads to becoming, and then they do something, and so they're motivated to know God more, and it just keeps snowballing and going. And no man lives this out perfectly, but this is the essence of godly manhood and influence according to Daniel 11:32. Knowing, being, and doing. Knowing God, becoming like God, and then doing something for God. William Carey phrased it this way: expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. And he sure did. He was one of the greatest missionaries that India ever saw. So what is godly manhood? It is influencing others for righteousness. It requires knowledge, it requires character, it requires courage, and it requires time. The people that probably influenced you the most were people that you spent time with. People that spent time with you. So, what is preventing men from becoming godly? Again, not all men, but many men. What is preventing men from becoming godly? That's our third question. Our first question is, where are the godly men? Second question is, what is godly manhood? And the third question, what prevents Christian men from becoming spiritually mature? Well, a lot of Christian men, first of all, are people pleasers. In other words, they fear men. They're going to do what other people want them to do. Proverbs 29:25 says, the fear of man brings a snare. It's a trap. If you make decisions primarily based on how people are going to respond to that or what people are going to think, even at times what your wife and kids are going to think, then you will often make wrong decisions. The fear of man brings a snare, Proverbs 29:25 says, but whoever trusts in the Lord will dwell in safety. The fear of God is the antidote to the fear of man. Do you fear God more or do you fear men more? Do you fear your boss getting upset with you if you don't put in those extra hours on Sunday? Or do you say, no, I'm going to spend time with God. I'm going to spend time with my family on Sundays. Do you fear God or do you fear your boss? How about love of self? One of the reasons men are not growing to godly manhood is because they love themselves too much. And when I'm not making good progress as a Christian, this is normally the reason. I love myself too much. Turn over to 2 Timothy chapter 3, please. 2 Timothy chapter 3. Paul is describing here what life will be like here in the church age before Jesus comes back. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, he says, but realize this, that in the last days, and we're living in the last days basically speaks of the time from Jesus' first coming until his second coming, till the rapture, which is not identical to the second coming. He says, in the last days, difficult times will come. And that would certainly include the tribulation period as well. So yeah, we could say from Jesus' first coming to second coming. It says, realize this, in the last days, difficult times will come. Verse 2, men will be lovers of self. Lovers of self. Here's the primary reason a lot of men never make it to godly manhood. They just love themselves too much. They do what they want to do. Their agenda is not God's agenda. That takes many different forms. For some, it's working too much. For some, it's playing too much. For some, it's pursuing sin. I think a third cause of lack of godly manhood is ignorance. Ignorance. What do I mean by ignorance? I mean, some of you didn't have godly dads, and so you say, I don't know how to be a godly man. Nobody modeled this for me. Maybe my pastor wasn't godly, unfortunately. I don't know how to be a godly man. Well, let me encourage you. Are you going to break the cycle? Are you going to do whatever it takes to become a godly man, even though you didn't have a model? And I'm not minimizing the importance of that. All I'm suggesting is don't use your past as an excuse for your failures today. Don't say, I'm not a godly dad because I didn't have a godly dad. Don't say, I'm not a godly man because my pastor never modeled for me how to become a godly man. You must be the one to break the cycle. If you're not going to do it, who's going to do it in your family? How many more generations are going to be ruined before you break the cycle? And young men, if you don't have a godly dad, maybe your dad's not saved, or maybe he's not growing to spiritual maturity, you need to find a godly man at Foundation that you can spend time with and learn from and emulate. Maybe say, come to me or Pastor Greg and say, hey, Pastor Greg, I want to be discipled. Is there a man you can pair me up with? You can teach me what it is to be a godly man. If your dad can't do it, then seek out a godly man from the church. And you can break the cycle. For instance, Joseph in the last chapters of Genesis, his dad Jacob was not a godly man for much of his adult life. But Joseph did okay, didn't he? Why? Because God was with him. Joseph did okay. He shows us we can do okay without a great example in our father. It puts you at a disadvantage, but God knows those circumstances, and God sovereignly chose the circumstances of your life. He's not the author of evil, but he put you in the exact family that you should be in. And if he put you in the family without a godly dad, then God knows exactly what he's doing. So fear of man, love of self, ignorance. A fourth cause of the lack of godly manhood is fear. Fear. Some men are scared to try to become godly men because they think they'll never catch up to their wife. The Lord has blessed us with so many godly ladies, and I'm thankful for each of these godly ladies, and I'm not minimizing your influence. But if God has given you one of those uber godly wives, don't use that as an excuse. I remember somebody from probably 5 or 10 years ago who this was basically his excuse. Now, he wouldn't admit this. This was basically his excuse for why he didn't really try to be a godly man, because his wife was uber godly and he didn't think he would catch up to her. And so he basically didn't try. But let me say this, you don't have to catch up to your wife if you're getting a late start. But what would your wife rather have? Would she rather have a man who can't lead her at all, or a man who is growing? She would choose the latter, right? Let me illustrate it this way. Maybe some of you haven't started saving for retirement. And you get to 45 or 50 and you think, well, I haven't started saving for retirement. Why bother? Is that a wise answer? Well, I'm getting a late start, so I'm not even going to try. Or should you say, I'm way behind. I should have been doing this 20 years ago, but for the next 15 years, I'm going to work hard and at least I can save something. Obviously, the latter option is better. You see my point. You may not be able to catch up to your wife spiritually, but that's okay. Why don't you start? Why don't you start growing? Why don't you become born again by turning from your sins and believing? And if you are saved, why don't you start pursuing God? She's not looking for perfection. She's just looking for a spiritual leader. So fear is sometimes a cause for why men do not become godly. Number 5 reason, and this one might surprise you a little bit, but I'm convinced it's a leading factor. Debt. Debt. If someone gets into foolish debt, they simply don't have the time to invest in others because they're having to pay off their debts. So can I challenge you, friends? Stay out of debt if you want to be a godly leader. You say, well, I can be in debt and still be a godly man. Perhaps, but what time are you going to have to influence others? Stay out of unnecessary debt if you want to be a godly leader. Number 6. 6 common reason why men don't grow to godly manhood often is that they have misplaced devotion, misplaced priorities. Maybe work gets all their time. Maybe they don't enjoy being around their wife, and so they don't want to come home. Maybe she's a nag. Maybe they're more concerned about what their boss thinks, as I mentioned earlier. Maybe they just love money. Maybe they love the esteem. Whatever reason. Misplaced devotion will keep you from being a godly leader. Hobbies. Whether it be video games or sports, computers, whatever it might be. Some men are home, but they're not home. They're sitting in front of the TV while their kids go to hell. Some people, their devotion is a woman. Maybe they're so consumed with finding a wife that maybe God is not going to give them a wife because they wouldn't be able to spiritually lead her because they have made an idol out of being married. Misplaced devotion is a common reason. Another common reason number 7, is that some men are defiled. Some men are defiled. They can't be a spiritual leader because they're addicted to cigarettes or drugs or alcohol. I mean, are you going to sit there puffing on a cigarette, blowing it in your kid's face, and telling your kids God can help you to overcome any sin habit? Are they going to believe it? If you haven't seen the victory of the Lord in your life, and I don't say that harshly, men, I just say it honestly. How can you tell your kids that God can help them to overcome any sin habit if you're not overcoming sin habits? Some men are defiled by bitterness. They're so bitter at their wives. They're unthankful, and maybe they don't even know it. They can't lead when they're bitter. They're angry. They're yelling at their kids, they're explosive, and then they feel such remorse, and then they apologize, and they're bitter. Maybe they're upset about what God hasn't given them or what God has given them, and so they're rendered ineffective in their leadership. Some men are defiled by sexual impurity. This may be the number one reason. If not, it's really close. The number one reason that we don't have godly men today like we need is pornography. My dad is convinced, and I think he's probably right on this. My dad is convinced that the lack of men going into pastorates and going to the mission field is directly connected to pornography. We know God cares about the lost. We know he tells us to pray that he would send out laborers to the harvest field. So I'm confident he's answering those prayers and burdening people to go to the mission field. But there are so many young men out there who simply cannot answer the call to the pastorate and to the mission field because they know in their conscience they're defiled. They are not experiencing victory over sexual impurity, and so they know they shouldn't be a pastor. And while I respect them for not going into it when they're disqualified, where are the guys that are going to say, I'm not going to be a product of my culture. I'm not going to be a product of the world here. I'm going to rise above this by the grace of God, and I'm going to answer the call to the pastorate. I'm going to answer the call to the mission field, and I'm going to lay aside any sin that so easily besets me and that holds me back, and I'm going to run with endurance. Where are the young men and men who are going to answer that call? Or are you going to content yourself just to continue to scroll through garbage on your phone? I think pornography is the leading reason for our lack of pastors and missionaries today. Another reason for a lack of missionaries is that parents simply are discouraging their kids from going to the mission field. They don't want them going to the mission field. They want them getting a good, high-paying job. They want them to be financially secure, whatever that means. And so they're discouraging their kids from answering the call. You say, Pastor Michael, this is a really discouraging message. Well, I promise you, next week's message will be more encouraging. What I wanted to do today was try to paint the need. And we've started getting to the answer when we looked at Daniel 11:32. What does a godly man do? But I wanted to paint the dire need because if you don't see the need, you won't answer the call. And we do have a need for godly men. Men, please understand that you growing to spiritual maturity is the greatest need of our day. That's my opinion. I believe the Bible and statistics would back that up. Godly men are the greatest need of our day. The opportunity is there. The fields are wide unto harvest. There are ladies looking for godly men to marry. There are kids who are looking to their dads for spiritual leadership. There are young men in the church that don't have godly dads. They're looking to a friend in the church, a godly man who would come alongside them and mentor them. We need Sunday school teachers. The world needs pastors. The world needs missionaries. Foundation Baptist Church needs more godly men. I want to answer the call. How about you?